So, good evening. We resume in the 26th chapter of the Life Divine, the ascent towards supermind. Sri Aurobindo had described how we must become aware of the inner parts of our nature, the inner forces which drive us normally in ignorance. We must convert them into figurings of knowledge. We must, at some point, evolve beyond the fixity in the mind and rise to an intuitive level of consciousness which allows rays of truth to work in us. This fusion of person and universe in an illuminated consciousness is what builds an actual bridge to the higher consciousness of the supramental as it seeks to manifest in the world through us. We must be able to step beyond the bounds of egoity. We must be able to become universalized individuals. And yet, as he will describe next, establishing the play of intuition in our consciousness so that it becomes normal to us is not an easy task. We'll pick up his argument there. A harmonious other world in which an intuitive mental intelligence of this kind, and its control would be the rule, is conceivable. But in our plane of being, owing to the original intention and past history of the evolutionary plan, such a rule and control could with difficulty be stabilized, and it is not likely that it could be complete, final, and definitive. So, if the question is, can we station the higher part of our consciousness in an overhead awareness, that is, live in intuition proper? We could. We do. We can. Yogis have achieved this. But the question is, can we fix it in the earth atmosphere? And if we attempt it, how is it that we meet the evolutionary plan and accord ourselves with that? He continues, for an intuitive mentality, intervening in a mixed mental, vital, physical consciousness would normally be forced to undergo a mixture with the inferior stuff of consciousness already evolved. In order to act on it, it would have to enter into it, and entering in it would get entangled in it, penetrated by it, affected by the separative and partial character of our mind's action and the limitation and restricted force of the ignorance. So intuition would be hampered by the lower mixture in which it enters. The action of intuitive intelligence is keen and luminous enough to penetrate and modify, but not large and whole enough to swallow up into itself and abolish the mass of the ignorance and inconscience. It could not effect an entire transformation of the whole consciousness into its own stuff and power. So the intuition is far above the ratiocinative powers of the philosophic mind. To get to intuition, if you remember how he ordered the ranges of the higher consciousness, we step beyond spiritual mind into the higher mind. From the higher mind into illumined mind. And only then do we gain access to intuition proper. But getting the play of intuition working in us means that a ray of light, a profound insight, a revelation of truth occurs, but at a point. It is not massive. It is not the effulgence of the sun. It is a ray coming out of the sun. And if you're going to do battle with the massive nature of the cosmic ignorance and try to convert or reveal the hidden splendors of the divine which sleep within it untapped, you have to have a consciousness that is wider than the ignorance. It cannot be a ray of light. It's got to be, in a sense, the sun itself descending, no? So, he continues, still, even in our present state, a participation of a kind is there, and our normal intelligence is sufficiently awake for the universal conscious force to work through it and allow the intelligence and will to exercise a certain amount of direction of inner and outer circumstance, fumbling enough and at every moment dogged by error, capable only of a limited effect in power, not commensurate with the larger totality of her vast operations. Reminds one of the line in Subject, stumbling through fog in search of paradise. In the evolution towards supernature, this initial power of conscious participation in the universal working would enlarge in the individual into a more and more intimate and extended vision of her workings in himself, a sensitive perception of the course she was taking, a growing understanding or intuitive idea of the methods that had to be followed for a more rapid and more conscious self-evolution. The goal being to reach the supernature, which can supplant or reveal within the ignorant nature what lies within. The supernature exists eternally above. It is that which we call, really, the supramental as an expression of Sat Chit Ananda. So that's the higher reality. That is the supernature. The nature that we know, the regular Prakriti, is that concealed and condensed into a nature of mind, life, and body, which are limitations of higher forces and powers of its being. As his inner psychic or occult inner mental being came more to the front, there would be a strengthened power of choice, of sanction, a beginning of authentic free will, which would grow more and more effective. But this free will would be mostly in relation to his own workings of nature. It would mean only a freer, fuller, and more immediately perceptive control of the motions of his own being. Even there, it could not be at first completely free, so long as it was imprisoned in the limits created by its own formations, or combated by imperfection due to a mixture of the old and the new consciousness. Still, there would be an increasing mastery and knowledge and an opening to a higher being and a higher nature. Crucially important. So we see here a picture of the inner soul the hidden truth of our being, coming into the front, suffusing the nature with its presence. As it comes to the front, what we are doing is bringing the true individual into the workings of ordinary nature. The true individual is a divine spark. So, what nature has been trying to affect in us through the operations of the ignorance, driving forward without our knowing it, the whole process of evolution, that is unnecessary. So the lessons that you typically get from the world, you're now able to learn through the soul's growth, which means that you can begin to act in solidarity with the world by choice, by selection. And so, becoming an agent of the divine will, acting in solidarity with the universe, means that your will becomes increasingly free. Until then, you don't have free will. You are acting by determination. The determinism of nature is carrying you forward step by step, and you think that you're free to do this or do that, but you aren't. He'll come back to this point in a moment. But here he's saying that even if you brought this forward, the effect of it would be to give you more free will at your individual personal level. You would begin to become master of your own being. But the idea of transformation means that you're working in solidarity with the world. That's a larger prospect. And so simply gaining access to the soul, etc., will not give you the key to unlock that mystery of transformation. But if you get that, if you find your soul and can live from that, and begin to act authentically, shall we say, you do get more mastery, you do get more knowledge, and so consciousness and will play more fully and truly in your being. And now he deals with this idea of free will. Our notion of free will is apt to be tainted with the excessive individualism of the human ego, and to assume the figure of an independent will acting on its own isolated account, in a complete liberty, without any determination other than its own choice and single unrelated movement. This idea ignores the fact that our natural being is a part of cosmic nature and our spiritual being exists only by the supreme transcendence. Our total being can rise out of subjection to fact of present nature only by an identification with a greater truth and a greater nature. The will of the individual, even when completely free, could not act in an isolated independence because the individual being and nature are included in the universal being and nature and dependent on the all-overruling transcendence. So this is the larger picture. There is no such thing as the ego's free will to do as it chooses. It's always part of a larger context. It may not be aware of it, but it's being determined by the machinery of nature. But above nature, above the cosmos, is the transcendence from both universe and individual come from that. So the transcendence, the universality, and the individuality are all parts of one being, yes, but it is the transcendence which is the ultimate ruler of the cosmos. And the cosmos acts through the limited individual. But the core truth of the limited individual is identity in personhood with the transcendent. So in a way, it represents both powers, both the power of extension into manifestation and the power of the permanence of the eternal self above. He continues, there could indeed be in the ascent a dual line. On one line, the being could feel and behave as an independent self-existence, uniting itself with its own impersonal reality. It could, so self-conceived, act with a great force, but either this action would be still within an enlarged frame of its past and present self-formation of power of nature, or else it would be the cosmic or supreme force that acted in it, and there would be no personal initiation of action, no sense, therefore, of individual free will, but only of an impersonal cosmic or supreme will or energy at its work. So this is what happens when we ascend into the sheer realization of the self. On the other line, the being would feel itself a spiritual instrument, and so act as a power of the Supreme Being, limited in its workings only by the potencies of the supernature, which are without bounds or any restriction except its own truth and self-law, and by the will in her. So the first line is realizing the self-existence. The second line is realizing oneself as a spiritual instrument. But in either case, there would be, as the condition of a freedom from the control of a mechanical action of nature forces, a submission to a greater conscious power, or an acquiescent unity of the individual being with its intention and movement in his own and in the world's existence. So if we sublate ourselves into the self above, then in a sense the separativity, the self that we are becomes one with the universal impersonal being above. And in a way, we become the drop merged in the ocean. And in the second way, submission becomes the keynote. For the action of a new power of being in a higher range of consciousness might, even in its control on outer nature, be extraordinarily effective, but only because of its light of vision and a consequent harmony or identification with the cosmic and transcendent will. For it is when it becomes an instrumentation of a higher instead of a lower power that the will of the being becomes free from a mechanical determinism by action and process of cosmic mind energy, life energy, matter energy, and an ignorant subjection to the drive of this inferior nature. A power of initiation, even of an individual overseeing of world forces, could be there, but it would be an instrumental initiation, a delegated overseeing. The choice of the individual would receive the sanction of the infinite because it was itself an expression of some truth of the infinite. Thus, the individuality would become more and more powerful and effective in proportion as it realized itself as a center and formation of the universal and transcendent being and nature. For as the progression of the change proceeded, the energy of the liberated individual would be no longer the limited energy of mind, life, and body with which it started. The being would emerge into and put on, even as there would emerge in him and descend into him, assuming him into it, a greater light of consciousness and a greater action of force. His natural existence would be the instrumentation of a superior power, and over mental and supramental consciousness force, the power of the original divine Shakti. So one can see that as one gives up the sense of an isolated self, and this light and power begin to descend into one, and one accepts and acquiesces, then you become, in a sense, a brilliant point through which this consciousness from above expresses itself. You might also see that this is essentially, without calling attention to it, a self-description of Sri Aurobindo. He is describing here the profound change that took place in his being as he practiced yoga, transformative yoga, over decades. And over mental and supramental consciousness force. Consciousness force. The supramental expresses the Chit Shakti of Sat Chit Ananda, a supreme and universal force, power of the original divine Shakti. So the Shakti, in a sense, is Sat Chit Ananda. In fact, if you read 1,000 names of the Divine Mother, Sri Lalita Sahasranama, she is described as such, Satchitananda Rupani. She takes the form of Satchit Ananda. The Divine Mother takes this form and then expresses through that her supramental radiances, which are the real source of creation. The infinities that exist within Satchit Ananda are expressed harmoniously through the supramental level, and then another universal manifestation occurs. There might be, you could say, a supramental universe, creation, and then there is the derivation in which we live, which has encased within it a sleeping supramental truth, and all the steps of nature, from matter, life, and mind, are guiding us back through this coiling process of evolution towards that. And that consciousness, that Shakti, descending into this consciousness and power is what awakens it. As we'll see in a moment, again, he's writing here not only about himself, but he's dealing with the subject which he covers in the book, The Mother. And we were reading some of that last week in chapter 6. All the processes of the evolution would be felt as the action of a supreme and universal consciousness, a supreme and universal force, working in whatever way it chose, on whatever level, within whatever self-determined limits, a conscious working of the transcendent and cosmic being, the action of the omnipotent and omniscient World Mother, raising the being into herself, into her supernature. In place of the nature of ignorance, with the individual as its closed field and unconscious or half-conscious instrument, there would be a supernature of the divine gnosis, and the individual soul would be its conscious, open, and free field and instrument, a participant in its action, aware of its purpose and process, aware, too, of its own greater self, the universal, the transcendent reality, and of its own person, as illimitably one with that, and yet an individual being of its being, an instrument and a spiritual center. So what he's just described is both of those stages merged together. The reality of the self-existence above, fused with the recognition that one is a spiritual instrument, and You become the point of a conscious universe living in radiant oneness with the transcendent, and yet you have not abrogated your own unique being. Your soul remains. It is not abolished, annulled in any way. So you are this bright point, an awakened soul, awakened to the universal aspect of the Great Self. And both express the divine transcendence. A first opening towards this participation in an action of supernature is a condition of the return. I'll start again. A first opening towards this participation in an action of supernature is a condition of the turn towards the last, the supramental transformation. For this transformation is the completion of a passage from the obscure harmony of a blind automatism with which nature sets out to the luminous, authentic spontaneity, the infallible motion of the self-existent truth of the Spirit. The evolution begins with the automatism of matter and of a lower life in which all obeys implicitly the drive of nature, fulfills mechanically its law of being, and therefore succeeds in maintaining a harmony of its limited type of existence and action. It proceeds through the pregnant confusion of the mind and life of a humanity driven by this inferior nature, but struggling to escape from her limitations, to master and drive and use her. It emerges into a greater spontaneous harmony and automatic self-fulfilling action founded on the spiritual truth of things. In this higher state, the consciousness will see that truth and follow the line of its energies with a full knowledge, with a strong participation and instrumental mastery, a complete delight in action and existence. There will be a luminous and enjoyed perfection of unity with all, instead of a blind and suffered subjection of the individual to the universal. And at every moment, the action of the universal in the individual and the individual in the universal will be enlightened and governed by the rule of the transcendent supernature. So this is the first opening. This is the first condition that he describes. But this highest condition is difficult and must evidently take long to bring about. For the participation and consent of the Purusha to the transition is not sufficient. There must be also the consent and participation of the Prakriti. So here Sri Aurobindo addresses the unification of the being. The old way we did spirituality was to separate the consciousness from nature, no longer identify with it, forget about its difficulties, let's live in the pure spirit. Not so here. If we're going to transform nature, if we're going to fulfill evolution, then Prakriti has to come along. How do we gain her adherence? It is not only the central thought and will that have to acquiesce, but all the parts of our being must assent and surrender to the law of the spiritual truth. All has to learn to obey the government of the conscious divine power in the members. Here again, an echo from his book, The Mother. Here again, the necessity of decades of tapasya, of work, hard labor, to get this done, to effect this kind of surrender, this kind of agreement in all the levels of the being, to concord and be present in that agreement at once. There are obstinate difficulties in our being, born of its evolutionary constitution, which militate against this ascent. For some of these parts are still subject to the inconscious and subconscious, and to the lower automatism of habit, or so-called law of nature. Mechanical habit of mind, habit of life, habit of instinct, habit of personality, habit of character, the ingrained mental, vital, physical needs, impulses, desires of the natural man, the old functionings of all kinds that are rooted there so deep that it would seem as if we had to dig to abysmal foundations in order to get them out. These parts refuse to give up their response to the lower law founded in the inconscient. They continually send up to the conscious mind and life the old reactions and seek to reaffirm them there as the eternal rule of nature. And if we were reading Indian philosophy, we would be talking here about the nature of the sanskaras, about the nature of the vasanas. Other parts of the being are less obscure and mechanical and rooted in inconscience, but all are imperfect and attached to their imperfection and have their own obstinate reactions. The vital part is wedded to the law of self-affirmation and desire. The mind is attached to its own formed movements, and both are willingly obedient to the inferior law of the ignorance. And yet, the law of participation and the law of surrender are imperative. At each step of the transition, the assent of the Purusha is needed, and there must be, too, the consent of each part of the nature to the action of the higher power for its change. So again, he restates the difficulty. We have to say yes from every level to this. Inside, the Purusha stationed in the mind, Manomaya Purusha, Purusha stationed in vitality, Pranamaya Purusha, Purusha stationed behind the body, in the body, Annamaya Purusha, all must agree. But the actual nature parts must also come along. So it is an enormous prospect. The rule of conscious obedience to the higher truth of the Spirit, the surrender of the whole being to the light and power that come from the supernature, is a second condition which has to be accomplished slowly and with difficulty by the being itself before the supramental transformation can become at all possible. Self-direction and surrender. So, we can see why it takes long, and we can see why it is rash for any ego to think that, barring these greater realizations, that the supramental work ought to be finished soon, that we should be able to bring this into prospect very quickly. We can say that if the lives of Mother and Sri Aurobindo, wedded to this ideal with all energy, vigor, and consciousness over a period of decades, could not affect it perfectly, then somebody who has just come into contact with this idea is not likely to affect its fruition. I say that only because there are scores of people thinking that they're on the verge of the supramental transformation. So, be cautious. Be sincere. Do the given work first. It follows, he writes, that the psychic and the spiritual transformation must be far advanced, even as complete as may be, before there can be any beginning of the third and consummating supramental change. For it is only by this double transmutation that the self-will of the ignorance can be totally altered into a spiritual obedience to the remolding truth and will of the greater consciousness of the infinite. So, the psychic spiritual realization, combining the self-will and the self-surrender. A long, difficult stage of constant effort, energism, austerity of the personal will, tapasya, has ordinarily to be traversed before a more decisive stage can be reached, in which a state of self-giving of all the being to the Supreme Being and the Supreme Nature can become total and absolute. Interesting that he brings in here the term tapasya, because, of course, it is a yogic term, and yoga is the engine of this transformation. To Sri Aurobindo, this change of consciousness, this importation of the supernature into nature, is going to come about through the practice of tapasya. And if you read the Upanishads, you will see that it is rare that the term yoga is ever used there. The term more consistently used is tapasya. Tapas, heat, concentration, building great energy. Tapasya is that process. And it is the practice of tapasya that leads to these results that we envisage as our goal. There has to be a preliminary stage of seeking and effort with a central offering or self-giving of the heart and soul and mind to the highest, and a later mediate stage of total conscious reliance on its greater power, aiding the personal endeavor. That integral reliance again must grow into a final, complete abandonment of oneself in every part, in every movement, to the working of the higher truth in the nature. Offering, reliance, abandonment. The totality of this abandonment can only come if the psychic change has been complete or the spiritual transformation has reached a very high state of achievement. For it implies a giving up by the mind of all its molds, ideas, mental formations, of all opinion, of all its habits of intellectual observation and judgment, to be replaced first by an intuitive and then by an overmind or supramental functioning which inaugurates the action of a direct truth consciousness, truth sight, truth discernment, a new consciousness which is in all its ways quite foreign to our mind's present nature. Here again we have echoes of his book, The Mother. There is demanded, too, a similar giving up by the vital of its cherished desires, emotions, feelings, impulses, grooves of sensation, forceful mechanism of action and reaction, to be replaced by a luminous, desireless, free, and yet automatically self-determining force, the force of a centralized, universal, and impersonal knowledge, power, delight, of which the life must become an instrument and an epiphany, but of which it has at present no inkling and no sense of its greater joy and strength for fulfillment. Impersonal knowledge, power, delight. Satchit Ananda again. Our physical part has to give up its instincts, needs, blind conservative attachments, settled grooves of nature, its doubt and disbelief in all that is beyond itself, its faith in the inevitability of the fixed functionings of the physical mind, the physical life, and the body, that they may be replaced by a new power which establishes its own greater law and functioning in form and force of matter. So this suggests that we have to give up all limits that we ordinarily understand to be the rules of the game at the physical level, including even death. And we find here a real consonance between what Mother was recording in her experiences in the agenda and what Sri Aurobindo has written here in these luminous phrases. Even the inconscient and subconscient have to become conscient in us, susceptible to the higher light, no longer obstructive to the fulfilling action of the consciousness force, but more and more a mold and lower basis of the spirit. So if you can imagine that this consciousness within you is growing and you have become aware of your soul and broken down all the barriers so that the soul flows freely into the nature, your personal nature, and then to the all nature around, and you become one with the universe without losing yourself, without becoming destroyed in the process of the drop merging into the ocean, because the drop maintains its reality, but becomes one with all the sea of conscious being around. Well, this is like an ensphering experience. You begin to grow up in consciousness. You begin to grow wide in consciousness. You begin to go down. The sphere is becoming enlarged. It's no longer just you, the little sphere of your own being. And so, in a sense, you become conterminous with the ranges of the super-rational consciousness above you, and you begin to dive into the actual enginery of the subconscious, even bordering the inconscient. So what used to be murky in you becomes plain, and you see all the veiled forces that have been working and trying to produce actions and results in you. You see them, and you can actually do something about that. And as you move into the inconscient, you're dealing with the ultimate laws of the universe there. So with the height of your consciousness, paired with the depth of your vision, you can begin to work upon that. And this is where Sri Aurobindo and Mother were at labor constantly, again, for decades. These things cannot be done so long as either mind, life, or physical consciousness are the leading powers of being or have any dominance. I can tell you that in Sri Aurobindo's case, he was not dominated by mind, life, or physical consciousness. Rather, the reverse had become true. He was centered above and extending his power below, ranging without losing his grip on physicality from those higher regions here. But the order of primacy had been reversed. The admission of such a change can only be brought about by a full emergence of the soul and inner being, the dominance of the psychic and spiritual will, and a long working of their light and power on the parts of the being, a psychic and spiritual remolding of the whole nature. So, and this is our work, to find the soul and to live in the cosmic spirit and make both powers that are active in our life, not simply static inner realizations, but that their energies are harnessed in the personal being, answering the dictates of the transcendence who wishes it to be done. That is a good place to put our bookmark this time. And we'll take up more next week as we move forward in the life divine. But before we go, this idea of extending a new consciousness into the world, into Earth, in Mother's conceptive consciousness, was thrown out in the luminous vision of Aurobindo, and the 50th anniversary of Aurobindo is just a couple of days away. The 28th of February 1968 was the date it was established, and I thought we could just read a couple of pages from her collected works which touch upon this city of dawn. Aurobindo wants to be a universal town where men and women of all countries are able to live in peace and progressive harmony, above all creeds, all politics, and all nationalities. The purpose of Aurobindo is to realize human unity. She wrote this on the 8th of September in 1965. She noted a few conditions for living in Aurobindo. From the psychological point of view, the required conditions are: 1, to be convinced of the essential unity of mankind, and to have the will to collaborate for the material realization of that unity. 2, to have the will to collaborate in all that furthers future realizations. The material conditions will be worked out as the realization proceeds. 19 June 1967. The aims of Aurobindo: an effective human unity, peace upon earth. Aurobindo, the city at the service of truth. This written on 28 February 1968, the day of its founding. Greetings from Aurobindo to all men of goodwill. Are invited to Aurobindo all those who thirst for progress and aspire to a higher and truer life. And the Aurobindo Charter. 1. Aurobindo belongs to nobody in particular. Aurobindo belongs to humanity as a whole. But to live in Aurobindo, one must be the willing servitor of the divine consciousness. 2. Aurobindo will be the place of an unending education, of constant progress, and a youth that never ages. 3. Aurobindo wants to be the bridge between the past and the future, taking advantage of all discoveries from without and from within. Aurobindo will boldly spring towards future realizations. 4. Auroville will be a site of material and spiritual researches for a living embodiment of an actual human unity. Again, 28 February 1968. And hear this. At last, a place where one will be able to think only of progressing and transcending oneself. At last, a place where one will be able to live in peace, without conflicts and without rivalries of nations, religions, and ambitions. At last, a place where nothing will have the right to impose itself as the exclusive truth. So, I'll read some lines from Savitri, I think. This is a grand section in Book 3, the Book of the Divine Mother, Canto 3, the House of the Spirit and the New Creation. A last and mightiest transformation came. His soul was all in front like a great sea, flooding the mind and body with its waves. His being spread to embrace the universe, united the within and the without, to make of life a cosmic harmony, an empire of the immanent divine. In this tremendous universality, not only his soul nature and mind sense included every soul and mind in his, but even the life of flesh and nerve was changed, and grew one flesh and nerve with all that lives. He felt the joy of others as his joy. He bore the grief of others as his grief. His universal sympathy upbore, immense like ocean, the creation's load as earth upbears all beings' sacrifice, thrilled with the hidden transcendence, joy, and peace. There was no more division's endless scroll. One grew the Spirit's secret unity. All nature felt again the single bliss. There was no cleavage between soul and soul. There was no barrier between world and God. Overpowered were form and memory's limiting line. The covering mind was seized and torn apart. It was dissolved, and now no more could be. The one consciousness that made the world was seen. All now was luminosity and force. Abolished in its last thin, fainting trace, the circle of the little self was gone. The separate being could no more be felt. It disappeared and knew itself no more, lost in the Spirit's wide identity. His nature grew a movement of the all, exploring itself to find that all was he. His soul was a delegation of the all that turned from itself to join the one supreme. Transcended was the human formula. Man's heart that had obscured the inviolable assumed the mighty beating of a god's. His seeking mind seized in the truth that knows. His life was a flow of the universal life. He stood fulfilled on the world's highest line, awaiting the ascent beyond the world, awaiting the descent the world to save. Namaste. Jai Ma. And to all our friends on Zoom.